At $500 and with a 1 marathon lifespan, the Adios Pro Evo 1 was a shoe that I just didn't look at too seriously. It was a concept car that I didn't think Adidas would actually make. But fast forward 1 year, and not only was Adidas serious, but they've also made an update. This is the Adios Pro Evo 2. It's time to take it for a run. Yo, what's going on? My name is Kofuzi and I'm a non-elite runner who reviews running shoes here on YouTube. And today I want to talk to you guys all about the Adidas Adizero Adios Pro Evo 2. But before I give you my thoughts on this shoe, I do want to go over some disclosures. This is a pair of shoes that Adidas sent to me for the purpose of review, so I did not have to pay for these shoes. However, nobody's paying me to make this video or to include their brand in this video, and no one's going to get a chance to preview any of my footage or my thoughts before you guys get a chance to see this video on YouTube. So with that disclosure out of the way, let's talk about the Adios Pro Evo 2, and let's start with the specs. This is a 39mm stack height shoe with a scant 3mm drop, giving us 36mm of stack height in the forefoot. Now the foam that's in this shoe is labeled as Light Strike Pro Evo, and I think it's supposed to be the same foam that we saw last year in the original Adios Pro Evo 1. Now that shoe had the badging Light Strike Pro on it, and it put Adidas in the weird position where there was two different kinds of Light Strike Pro in the lineup. The Light Strike Pro that was in this $500 special shoe, and a very different kind of pro level foam that was in the Adios Pro 4, but that was also called Light Strike Pro. So I think what they've done this year is that they've just given it a different name. Light Strike Pro Evo is the same thing, I think, as the Light Strike Pro that was in the Evo 1. And I say I think because I'm actually not sure that these are the same. The process for making these shoes is very unique, and it also is what contributes to a lot of the cost. So in the process of making these shoes, there's a final step when you have the midsole foam where you compression mold it, and you take kind of like a blob that kind of looks like a midsole, and you compress it and shape it into the final shape that it needs to be in. Now what they've done with the Pro Evo series is they skip the compression molding step. Instead, they kind of carved out the midsole from a block of foam, kind of like a sculptor makes a sculpture out of a block of marble, let's say. And what that does is it kind of keeps some of the extra special nature of that foam intact because it doesn't go through that final compression molding process. It makes the foam really lively in an exciting way, and it keeps it very light and makes it less dense. And on the original Evo, you could kind of see some of the grooves from where it looks like either hand carving or machine carving, something carved this midsole out of a block of foam. Now when I look at the foam on the Evo 2, it doesn't have any grooves in it, which tells me that maybe they're using a different process for cutting out the midsoles from the blanks or blocks of the midsole foam. And maybe that's because there's also some painting that's going on here. This is a gray colored midsole or a silver metallic colored midsole, and that's not the color of the foam itself. This is like a paint that's adhered, or a color that's adhered to the outer layer of it. If you look at the bottom of the shoe, it's white, or mine was white before I ran on it, but it was white, and so that's the actual color of the foam. And so maybe that's causing for some of the differences in what's going on in the midsole foam here. But the foam looks to be a little bit different, and it feels in hand, like the texture of it definitely feels different. Also, what's different about this shoe is that it seems to have a very different rocker. Now, on the spec sheet that I received from Adidas, they point out that the shoe still has that 60% rocker that the Evo had last year. And what they mean by that is if you take the 100% length of the shoe at the 60% mark, that's when the rocker starts. And that's very early compared to a Adios Pro 3. It starts somewhere at like 70%. This one starts at 60. Now, both of these shoes may start at the same 60% mark, but I can see that there's a very different rocker shape to this shoe. And I think what's happening is it may be starting that rocker early, but it does very gradually, as if to have no change in the rocker. And then later on, then it comes up very aggressively, which which kind of reminds me more of the Adios Pro 3 in terms of the shape of this forefoot here. And so not only do we have a different drop from last year, there's a 3mm drop this year versus a 6mm drop last year, meaning that there's more foam in the forefoot, there's 3mm more height here. But I also think there's a very significant difference in the shape of the forefoot and the amount of foam that you're going to feel and when you're going to feel it as far as the gait cycle goes. Now on the outsole, we see something that's familiar as we saw last year. We still have that liquid rubber, but they've done something different to it because a lot of people were very concerned. I don't know if complained is the right word, because you can only complain really about something if you've tried it and then didn't like it. So people expressed concerns about how slick the bottom of this shoe looked with its liquid rubber. So this year they're still using liquid rubber, but there's grooves that are cut into it now so as to give the liquid rubber more chances to really bite and gain some traction when it's on the road. But I have about 30 miles in my shoe already, and it does look like it's already starting to see a little bit of wear because that liquid rubber is a very thin application of rubber, but it's still very tacky, like still making a lot of squeaking sounds even in these areas that seem like they might be a little bit worn down already. It's an extremely grippy, tacky substance. We still got kind of a big pad of it in the forefoot and then two skids on each side of the heel. Now moving to the upper, we have a very similar upper material. It's a translucent, transparent material that Adidas tells me is a metaphor for the lightness of the shoe. Now we have a silver metallic upper instead of a white one, and there are some subtle differences to note. One is that there are a different number of lace loops in this, and that might be one of the areas where they saved weight because every lace loop they had to put in this kind of felt grommet. There's 3 of them before we get to the kind of top 2 lace loops, whereas there was 4 in the Pro Evo 1. And the other real difference that I'm noting is the way that the 3 stripes are applied. In the Pro Evo 1, it's almost like they're sublimated on. I can feel it because it's a little bit of texture, but there isn't anything that I can like kind of feel. It's not like a sticker that's glued on. That's definitely the feeling that I'm getting here with the Evo 2. In fact, one of my stickers is starting to fall off. This happened like on the first run. It's still been holding on. It's putting up a valiant fight, but I feel like not that much longer before I lose this stripe. And even on the other side where it's still adhering very well, I could feel very significantly that this isn't like part of the upper, it's like on top of the upper. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how this is applied. I don't know if that's a weight saving thing, a cost saving things or what, but there is a slight difference. Functionally for me, I haven't even really noticed. The main thing that I noticed when I put this shoe on is how light this upper is, how minimal the upper is. There is a little bit of padding through the heel collar, just like in last year, but it's a very floppy shoe. There's not too much structure in here, just like how I like my race shoes. And the toe box is very, very tight. There's not a lot of height, and it also cuts in very aggressively from the outer toe, kind of chopping off the little end of your pinky toe and coming to a point at the front of the foot. And I think that a lot of what that does is it increases that feeling that the shoe is very agile, very nimble, very kind of like twitchy. Altogether, the package stays the exact same weight as last year, even though there's more foam in terms of stack height. And I think there's gonna be more foam in the forefoot based on the change to the shape of the rocker. Somehow still, they've managed to keep it at the same feather light weight, 138 grams and 4.8 ounces. Now that we talked about what this shoe is like on paper, let's talk about what it's like on the road. The Evo 2 has a lot of similarities and some important differences from the Evo 1. It's still an incredibly light shoe. It feels like a toy when you pick it up, but it's also a very responsive shoe, just like last year as well. It's not a super cushioned shoe, although I do see in my footage that the foam is compressing quite a bit. It doesn't feel like a super cushioned, super squishy shoe. I'm getting a lot of responsiveness from this shoe. I'm feeling a lot of bounce back. Adidas tells us that there's a 5% increased energy return in this shoe compared to a last shoe. And I think a lot of that's gonna come from the additional amount of midsole foam that they've put in this shoe, but it overall contributes to that sensation that the shoe is a lot bouncier this year, not in a squishy, springy kind of way, but in a very quick, jumps right off the ground kind of responsive way. And I think the fact that this shoe still feels firm and responsive to me is a bit of a surprise. I thought by adding more foam that I would get more dynamicness or dynamism in terms of the foam. It would squish and decompress more to give me a sense of explosiveness while also giving more of a sense of cushion. But that's not what I got here. I basically got the Evo 1 in a different kind of shoe shape. And I think it comes back to that rocker that I was talking about earlier. This isn't just a matter of kind of pixel peeping at subtle differences. I think this change makes a very big difference. For the shoe last year, I felt like when you hit that rocker, it's almost as if the front of the shoe disappeared, and it made the shoe feel very aggressive, very light, very fun to run in, very quick in terms of turnover. So it was an exciting shoe, but it was very aggressive. I personally, as a non-elite runner, didn't think that it was a marathon shoe for me. I raced a half marathon in it. I did get a PB in it. So it is a very fast shoe that I could take for long distances, but not for the long distance of the marathon because it was just too aggressive. There wasn't enough underfoot. I just felt like my feet were taking a beating. Now in this shoe, I haven't quite taken it to the full 26.2 distance, but what I'm feeling so far from my testing and the workouts that I've done in it so far is that there is more foam in that forefoot because I think the rocker is actually meaningfully starting later. While it technically may be still starting at that 60% point, I think meaningfully it's starting much later. And I think that because there's more stack height in the forefoot with that reduced drop, and I think because they've changed the angle at which this shoe tapers, I think that there is much more foam in terms of what you're actually feeling underneath the pads of your foot as your foot is hitting the ground and as you're pushing off. And so for me now, this shoe turns into a marathon distance shoe. It's a little bit on the firm side, but it's got all that Light Strike Pro or Light Strike Pro Evo goodness that I enjoyed in the last year's shoe, but it's giving to me in a marathon package. Now I've tested it at a variety of paces from VO2 max to slower than marathon pace, and I'm getting a range of experiences from that. When I'm at very fast efforts like VO2 max, 5K race pace type of efforts, I'm really putting a lot into the shoe. I'm pushing off very hard from the shoe. I'm landing very hard in the shoe. And that's when I feel like the foam is the most exciting. It's not so much that it's a bouncy foam, but it's kind of giving me like some resistance. It's fighting that compression. And then when it decompresses, it does it in a really exciting kind of pop. And that doesn't feel so firm. I really enjoy the foam when I'm running very fast in the shoe. Now the shoe changes a little bit as I get to kind of 10K threshold level where the shoe starts to feel a little bit more firm. I think maybe I'm not pushing hard enough into the shoe as a non-elite runner. And so I'm feeling more of the responsiveness, that firm responsiveness that I'm talking about, but it's still much more pleasant than it was last year because there's more foam in there. And I don't feel like I'm getting quite as much undesirable feedback from the ground, let's put it that way. And then when I'm getting into marathon pace, I feel like the way and the timing that my foot is hitting the ground, I feel like even though it is a bit on the firm side, I'm getting a really nice responsive pop from it, and it's very enjoyable to get through the gait cycle. I don't really feel like the carbon rods that are in here are doing a ton of work. They're not so obtrusive, but I do think they're doing quite a bit to help stabilize all this exciting foam that's underfoot. And so a lot of what I'm feeling in my mind and in my foot is that I'm hitting the geometry of the shoe just right at my marathon effort, and I'm rolling through and pushing off into that next stride in a very fun and quick way. When I get slower than marathon effort, that's where it's kind of, my foot strike is landing a little bit more midfoot and towards the heel, and that's when the shoe starts to be not all that great. It starts to feel a little bit slappy on the ground, and the footsteps start to get really awkward for me. And so I really feel like this shoe is more of a forefoot striker shoe than last year's midfoot striker shoe was. But that really works well for me as someone who lands on their forefoot when they're at marathon effort and faster. This is the part of the video where I normally like to zoom out and see where a shoe fits within a broader lineup with a brand, but I just did the Evo SL after 100 miles review video, I think like 2 weeks ago, so I just did that. I'll post a link in the description to that video if you need kind of a breakdown of the Adidas running shoe lineup. So instead, what I want to do with this portion of the video is talk about the two kinds of race shoes that Adidas has been making, and I think that might be a little controversial, but I think it's similar to what a lot of other brands are starting to do. We see it with Asics. They have the Metaspeed Sky and the Metaspeed Edge. We see that in Nike with the Vaporfly and the Alphafly. And we see it in Puma as well with the Deviate Nitro Elite 3 and the Fast R3. These are two different kinds of marathon shoes that each of these brands are making. And they're targeting two different styles of runner, or two different types of marathon runner. A lot of times it breaks down to oversimplify things, like a forefoot striker shoe and a heel striker shoe. Sometimes brands are making like a midfoot striker shoe and a forefoot striker shoe. And I think that's really what's going on with Adidas here. Let's break it down. I think the first shoe that I want to take a look at is the Adios Pro 3. This is, I guess, a couple of years old now, or maybe a year old now, but it was around for a really long time. And I think what defines it to me as a forefoot striker shoe is that there's this large landing pad in the front and then a relatively skinny arch and heel of the shoe. So you're really talking about landing on this front portion of the shoe. And then as we look at the geometry of the shoe, it stays pretty flat on the table until relatively late, when then it shoots up aggressively. And so if you're a forefoot striker, you're hitting it after the rocker. If you were a midfoot striker, you're kind of getting it before the rocker, and then you're going to have to kind of curl over the front of the rocker, and that might not be ideal for you. So this may not have been a perfect design for you, but if you're a forefoot striker like me, the Adios Pro 3 was a really fun shoe to be able to run in. Now, the other kind of shoe that Adidas makes is that midfoot striker shoe. And I think to talk about that, we got to go to the Takumi Sen, which is one of my personal favorite shoes that Adidas makes. And this one, I think, is more of a midfoot striker shoe, although it's a 5K, 10K shoe. So shoes that are meant for that distance can usually be run in by pretty much all runners because of the fast turnover required. But what makes this a midfoot striker shoe to me is that the rocker starts a little bit earlier and then it curls up, almost like kind of like a clown or elf shoe, because you're meant to land more in the midfoot and then roll and push off rather than compress the forefoot of the shoe and bounce off. See the difference? That's kind of how things fall for in my mind. Now, when we take a look at the Evo 1, I feel like, to me, this is a super Takumi. And so while this was kind of positioned as like the Super Adios Pro, to me it felt like the geometry was the same as the Takumi. The stack heights kind of felt the same as a Takumi. It just felt like it had a very special foam in it. It had that early rocker, 60%, and then you rolled to the front and then pushed off because you were a midfoot striking. I even think that the Adios Pro 4 switched from being a forefoot striker shoe to having that midfoot striker's geometry, where it had an early rocker position that curled up the entire way until your toes were kind of pointing up into the sky. And that's what we're getting a lot here, where you're going to land in the middle and then roll forward and then push off. And so that's what I'm seeing really with these three shoes. Where I see the Evo 2 fitting in is that it reminds me more of the Adios Pro 3 in terms of the way that these forefoots are designed, where they're, yes, it technically starts at the 60%, but meaningfully it starts much later, and then it has an aggressive, sharp angle rather than this long, gradual angle. Both of them end up pointing your toes to the sky because the toe springs are very aggressive, but the degree of the angle is much more aggressive on these forefoot striker shoe, so you're intended to land on it in the forefoot rather than land on it in the midfoot and then have to try to get over the hump of the toe spring that ends up being a little bit later. And so that's how I understand the differences in these two shoes. So if you went from the Adios Pro 3 to the Adios Pro 4 and were like, I don't like this as much for some reason, or maybe you didn't love the Adios Pro 3 but love the Adios Pro 4, a lot of it, I think, comes down to the shape and geometry of these shoes and how they were designed for different types of gaits. So a lot of times when we talk about super shoes help runners, but they help some runners more than others, I think a lot of that comes down to what kind of race shoe are you in, and is that lining up with the kind of foot strike, the kind of way that you normally run? Is it helping you, or are you having to fight it because you're you're in the kind of wrong type of shoe. And so this is kind of how I'm seeing the two types of racing shoes that Adidas makes. Hopefully if Adidas is watching this isn't too crazy and it makes sense, and hopefully it makes sense to you guys watching at home, but this is how I would make recommendations of which of the Adidas race products you should be in, depending on which of these you may have tried and enjoyed or didn't enjoy in the past. Now let's wrap up the video by going over the buying guide, and we'll also discuss some of the alternatives. The Adios Pro Evo 2 at $500 is still a shoe that I can't really recommend to a lot of people. But while last year's Evo 1 felt like it was too aggressive for non-elites to take to the marathon distance, I feel like the changes to the Evo 2 are small but significant, and this is now a shoe that even non-elites can take for the full 26.2. And with the lightness of the shoe, it's a viable option for pretty much any road distance, so long as you can handle that $500 price tag. Now, as far as alternatives or other shoes that can deliver a similar experience to this shoe, I think the closest alternatives are within the Adidas brand, and we've already talked about those in the last section. So let's talk about some other shoes from other brands to see how they stack up. And I guess at this point, it's just a parade of the most expensive running shoes that are on the market. Because the first shoe that I want to talk about is from On, and this is the On Cloudboom Strike LS. This is a really uniquely made shoe that takes a pre-formed midsole and outsole, and then a robot sprays on an upper in a 3-minute process that cures and paints the upper to create this laceless marvel of technology. There's a lot of similarities to me in the way that the foams feel on this shoe, in terms of the more you put into it, the more you're gonna get out of the shoe. And they're both a little bit firmer than I tend to like in my marathon race product. Now, I think the big difference is that I feel like the Cloudboom Strike LS could use even more foam or a little bit less density in it. It's even firmer than the Evo 2 is, and I prefer the experience in the Evo 2 quite a bit over what I'm getting in the Cloudboom Strike LS. But that's not to say that the foam isn't a great foam. I've been able to do a lot of workouts and racing in this shoe, and it is a lot of fun. It is 50 grams heavier though, but even then, that's still pretty light, as the shoe comes in at 6.8 ounces and under 200 grams at 192. The shoe is expensive though, but considerably cheaper than the Pro Evo 2. This shoe comes in at $330. And then the other shoe that I think we should take a look at is the recent entrant from Puma, and that is the Fast R3. This is, I think, gonna be one of the most exciting shoes of 2025. It's using aliphatic TPU and a really fun extended carbon fiber plate for a little bit of extra leverage on toe off. It's also an extremely light shoe, weighing in at 6.1 ounces and 174 grams, although that is significantly heavier than the Evo 2. And this shoe comes in at $300, which is also very expensive. But even though both of these shoes are very expensive and very lightweight, I think that's pretty much where the similarities end between these two shoes, because the foam experience and the run experience are quite different. I feel like I'm getting more of like the cushion in terms of the shock absorption and the compression of the foam, and then the right kind of decompression, the right pace of decompression in the aliphatic TPU in the Fast R3. And there's definitely more of a carbon involvement, a carbon pop sensation in the Fast R3 than what you're feeling in the Evo 2. So depending on what you like, depending on what kind of level of firmness, responsiveness, or cushion and softness that you want in your racing product, that should be the way that you decide between these two shoes. And for me personally, I would gladly take the trade-off in a little bit of weight for the cushion and comfort that I, as a non-elite runner, am getting in the Fast R3. So I give the nod to the Fast R3 on this one. Plus it is $200 cheaper. You can almost get two of those for the price of one Evo 2. Those are my thoughts on the Adios Pro Evo 2. An update that I appreciate. I find the shoe becomes a marathon shoe for the masses that feels elite at this point, finally, which is a very different type of shoe than the last one was. If you have any questions about the Evo 2 or any of the shoes that I talked about today, feel free to put them in the comments down below, or better yet, stop by the live stream I do Mondays and Thursdays over on the Kofuzi Run Club channel. I'd love to see you guys over there in the chat. That's all for today, everybody. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of this video. Hopefully you guys are staying safe out there on your runs, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yo, what's going on?